Congressman Ron Paul. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. Delighted to see a nice crowd. I have two members of my family with me today. I'd like to introduce them. They're sisters, Lisa and Linda. They're here, students. But I am pleased to be here, and it does look like there are more campers than there used to be. I've been talking about freedom for a long time. That's what motivated me to get into politics. And for many years, the crowds were very small. There was little interest, but it has steadily grown. And as the issue of and the message of liberty grew, our country got into worse shape. And they've come together now because so many people are realizing the problems that we have today, both domestically and economically, as well as the waste that we pursue overseas and the wars that we get involved. And all of a sudden, people are tired of the wars. They're tired of this economy. They're tired of the Federal Reserve. They're tired of Congress spending a lot of money. And they're looking for some change, and I have suggested one significant change. Why don't we just follow the Constitution? The Constitution is a great document, and I have personal beliefs, and they are that I believe individuals should have the right to their life, the right to their liberty, and also the right to keep what they earn. But fortunately for me, having been involved so long, that the Constitution and my personal belief come together. Because the oath of office doesn't say, well, I'm going to go to Washington and I'm going to fulfill my personal beliefs. We go to office and we say that we will defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And I am pleased because they come together, and the Constitution is a document that was meant to severely limit the size and scope of government. The purpose of the revolution, the purpose of the Constitution, was to protect your liberty. And unfortunately, though, we have drifted along away from that because very few people take seriously Article 1, Section 8, which tells us exactly what we're allowed to do. And the Congress, when they're told what some of their responsibilities, they don't seem to follow the things they're supposed to do, and they do all the things they're not supposed to do. And I think that's the way it is with all three departments. If you look at the executive branch, they now are probably the biggest writers of laws. If you look at all the regulations that are concerned, they write the regulation. Technically speaking, the executive branch is not supposed to write law. They're not supposed to write these regulations. And quite frankly, if I get the opportunity, I'm going to get a lot of those regulations repealed and removed from the books. I'd like to be the first president that we've had in the history of modern times where the Federal Registry actually shrunk in size rather than expanded by thousands and thousands of pages of regulations. But we have, spent way beyond our means. We have decided that our government was supposed to redistribute wealth, police the world, and tell you how to run your personal lives. I happen to believe differently. The Constitution gives none of us authority to police the world, tell other people how to live, and get involved in internal affairs of the nation, and decide all these things overseas. At the same time, it's not there to tell you how to run your personal life. It's there to protect the environment so that you can be energetic, work hard, assume responsibility of yourself, and be allowed to keep the fruits of your labor. At the same time, we have, over the many years with great prosperity, we concentrated too much on the redistribution of wealth, and we encouraged the lobbyists to take control. And we forgot about the most fundamental thing, and that's protecting the environment, protecting the concept of liberty, so that people do have the right to run their own lives and earn the living that they deserve. But we have met a crisis here in the last 4 years, which was a predictable crisis. Many of the economists knew there was a bubble, and we talked about it for a long time, and the bubble burst. And it's different this time. It is big time different. It's biggest in the history of the world, what we're facing today on the financial crisis. It's a dollar crisis. It's worldwide. There's never been a paper currency so engulfing the world economies, and this is why the crisis in Europe is your crisis. Today, the Federal Reserve is in big time bailing out Europe, and that means it's hurting you because they're going to print dollars and print these dollars and bail out the banks and bail out Greece. They'll tell you otherwise, but they're involved very much in doing this. But how did we get into the crisis? What happened in 2008? Well, we met a brick wall with the amount of debt we had. Debt is unsustainable once it reaches a certain point. Individuals know about it, and business people know about it. And when individuals do it, they know that they have to cut back. They might have to sell some things. They have to pay down their debt and get back to work again. They might have to take a second job. When governments get into this problem with too much debt, they try to raise taxes. If the economy is shrinking and there's not many people left to tax, then they can't do it. Then they start borrowing, but interest rates go up. And there's a limit to that because that will hurt the economy. So what do? They resort to the old trick. It's been around for a long time. They inflate the currency. They print the currency. This is why the Federal Reserve and the monetary system is so important. If you don't like big government, you have to understand the Federal Reserve, because governments don't get big without a Federal Reserve, because you have to quit spending. Interest rates would go up and the Congress couldn't just keep having these deficits. But finally it got out of hand and the bubble got so big and the bubble burst because of the huge debt. So my whole effort is to address this by facing up to the truth of the matter. Facing up to the truth of the matter, when you have too much debt, you have to get rid of it. That's what is a natural consequence of economics, is you need to get rid of the debt. And that's what the bubble does. It tries to. But the tragedy this last 4 years has been that the people who ran up the debt, the people on Wall Street, the corporations, the people who had benefited from all the financial bubbles going on, they went bankrupt. And guess what? Congress and the Fed bailed them out and dumped all the debt on the people in the middle class of America. And that is why the jobs were lost, and that is why people lost their homes. At the same time, they're making billions and billions of dollars again because of the bailouts. And this has continued. And this is characteristic of what happens when you destroy a currency. The middle class is wiped out when the currency is wiped out, and the wealthy get wealthier. And this is the time that we have to address this. And my proposal in the first year budget is to admit the truth. We spend too much. The deficit is too big. So I want to cut $1 trillion out of the budget the first year. This makes a few people nervous. Oh, you can't do it. That's too much. Oh, we need to borrow another $1 trillion. We need to print another $1 trillion. On and on. But no, that is what we have to do. People say, well, that means everybody will suffer? Not necessarily. Maybe the people who got bailed out, they might have to suffer, but they should suffer. They should go bankrupt, not us. But also, to do it, we have to have priorities, and I've listed my priorities, and they make sense as far as I'm concerned. That the money that we spend overseas should be the easiest money to cut. We're spending well over $1 trillion a year. It's probably about $1.4 trillion to operate all our activities overseas. I don't think it does much for our defense. We have a responsibility for national defense. That is part of a strong mandate in our Constitution. The national government is to take care of national defense. But just spending money, getting into policing the world and nation building, that doesn't help our defense. I guess it's into trouble. So I would say it is time to unwind the war, stop the spending, bring our troops home. It's time we stop it. How long do we have to stay in Korea? I mean, we've been there since I was in high school. We've been in Japan since World War II. We've been in Germany subsidizing their defense since World War II. And these wars are not helpful. If you can just see what's coming in Iraq, it's so sad about what's happening. Going into Iraq, Iraq, there was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Al-Qaeda is in Iraq now. They used to be arch enemy of Iran. Now they're buddying up to Iran, and they're buddying up to China. The whole thing is just coming down on us, and just think of the loss, the money lost, the troops lost, the injuries coming back, and there was no justification. They never attacked us. They never had weapons of mass destruction. They had nothing to do with 9/11. They had the first speech I gave on the House floor on why we ought to be careful not to go to war against Iraq was in 1998. That's when the policy was changed. The first cabinet meeting in 2001 was, when are we going to go get Iraq? It wasn't after 9/11. So the policies are bad. This is why I advocate a change in policy in order to save this money. That we ought to have a policy of non-intervention, a policy designed after the Constitution, taking the advice of the Founding Fathers. And for me personally, I think the best way to change our foreign policies is to look at foreign policy and follow the golden rule. Don't do anything to anybody else that we don't want them to do to us. We can save a lot of money, and I have priorities that I would protect. I would protect the elderly. I would protect the medical care for the elderly. I'd protect Social Security, medical care for the children. But I would cut a lot more. I have 5 departments I would cut. I, quite frankly, do not believe it's constitutional, nor helpful, nor beneficial to have the Department of Education. We could start right off there. And if we're serious about cutting, we have to go back a little bit into what year when we were spending less money. Believe it or not, we were spending a lot less money in 2006, but nobody complained that government was too small then. So I would go back to the budget levels of 2006 instead of automatically talking about increases forever and ever. So all this talk you hear in Washington about slashing the budget and having super committees, they're talking about we have to cut $1 trillion out of the budget. They're not cutting a nickel. What they're doing is they're talking about cutting proposed increases, automatic increases. Nobody wants to touch anything. And they won't, neither side will talk about cutting overseas spending and all the stationing of troops in the wars that were involved. They want to continue that, as well as some of the programs here at home. But we have to make a decision. What we have done is we've had a lot of good intentions. Take the housing program. That was based on a lot of good intentions. The Fed would create the money. The Congress would dictate that everybody gets a house and make loans simple. Everybody qualifies, and yet it backfired. People made a lot of money on Wall Street. They got involved in the derivatives market. They gambled and made billions. At the same time, when the crunch came, the middle class lost their jobs and lost their houses. So that it doesn't work. Think of all the effort to make sure that everybody gets a college education. I think that's wonderful. I'm very interested in making sure as many people as possible can get an education. But it hasn't been too many decades ago that education was cheap. It was cheap because there was no inflation. We could pay, $500 a semester. We could go to school. We could get a job and work our way through college. But now it's $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 a year, and you can't get a job. So the government has to come in and say, well, we'll give you the money. You just pay it back to us. You'll be an indentured servant to us forever. So what has happened? We've graduated more young people, and the educational levels have gone down. Still, jobs go begging in this country because they're not well trained. So we have more people graduating. They owe $1 trillion. They owe $1 trillion, more money than all our credit cards. And nobody wants to question that. But I would say that we have to question this whole system, what the role of government ought to be. We cannot solve our problem unless we ask that very important question. What should the role of government be? Should it be to protect our liberties, or is it to police the world, run your personal lives, and run the economy? If that's what you want, this can't work. We're going to just, in a few years, work our way to a much bigger catastrophic economic event, which I am trying desperately to stop. Because with a catastrophic economic event, you're going to have problems in the streets. We've already seen hints of that happening. We see it in Europe, and it's all linked together. The financial system is locked in together because it's a dollar system, and it's paper money, and it's an untrustworthy system. So what we need to do, though, is understand what the role of government should be. Now, we had a fantastic experiment in this country. We became the wealthiest country ever, the largest middle class ever, and now it's shrinking. The middle class is shrinking, our wealth is going down, and in the last 10 years, we've had approximately 30 million increase in our population, but no real new jobs. And that's why the wealth isn't there. So the economic pie is shrinking. Instead of wealth in this country, we have apparent wealth, but it's all based on debt. And we owe foreigners now. We owe the most of any country in the history of the world, over $3 trillion plus our $15 trillion national debt. So this cannot be sustained. When we shifted gears a while back, we concentrated too much on the apparent wealth that did come from having a free society. But that invited just the cronyism and the lobbying efforts to just have influence in government. Rather than putting the pressure on government to protect our freedoms, we put pressure on governments to see what we can get from government. The government has nothing. All they can do is take from one group and give it to another until you come up to the dead end. And that's where we are today. That's why we have to look at this. And it's not like we have to invent something new. I'm not talking about some idea that I've concocted. It's an idea that is America. Freedom, property rights, contract rights, sound money, rule of law. Let's just look at what's happening to our rule of law. Today, your personal liberties are under acute attack. Since 9/11, what have we had? We've had the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act is not a good bill. It violates, it cancels out the Fourth Amendment. I'd like to repeal the Patriot Act. And just what is happening here recently, our president about a year ago announced that, there's some very bad people out there. They've said some bad things and they've tried to influence violence against us. And American citizen, he said, yeah, that is true. He is so bad that I am instituting a new policy. We can assassinate American citizens without trial or charges. They've done it 3 times now. They did it at Alaki. He's probably a bad guy, but he still was an American citizen. It's this justification to throw out the rule of law. So they decided, well, his son might have been involved too. So a few days later, they assassinate him. But it turned out that he and his cousin were barbecuing out in the backyard. And he was 16 years old. I mean, we can't allow these precedents to be set. Last week, 2 weeks ago, it was the National Defense Authorization Act. In that bill, it now says that Posse Comitatus has been repealed, that the military can arrest anybody who might be associated with any type of violent activity, with a group, maybe a website, maybe a donation, maybe a meeting somebody attended, and they can be arrested by the military and denied an attorney. This is not good for us, because if the violence comes to the streets, which is quite possible, then all of a sudden, just in the name of law and order, this can happen. This is why we have to have a clear understanding what freedom is all about, what government should be all about, and what our Constitution says. And we do not have that. We have lost that, and this is why we're in a mess in this country today. But the encouraging thing for me is a lot of people are waking up. A lot of people are waking up. I go to the camps, a lot of young people are waking up. They know what's going on, and they are enthusiastic about the restoration of the cause of liberty, enthusiastic about getting out of all these entangling alliances and these wars that we're fighting overseas and this senseless spending. You don't need to be, matter of fact, it's almost better sometimes not to have a PhD in economics, because common sense tells us that arithmetic is all that we need. We're not supposed to spend money we don't have, and you can't do it. And you can't take a monopoly set and pull the money out and start spending it. I mean, common sense tells us it doesn't work. So we have been taught for decades about an economic policy that says deficits don't matter, spending is okay, and spending not only is okay, it's necessary, even if you run up debt. So it's these economic policies that have to be challenged. And the American people are challenging them today, because those who have been on the receiving end are getting frightened. that they're not going to get their handouts. And the people who are sick and tired of paying it for it know that something has to be done. And this is why this world and this country has changed a lot in the past 4 years. I ran 4 years ago. There was a lot of interest and a lot of excitement, and yet in these last 4 years it's been discovered the American people now, by a large number, want us to come out of Afghanistan and come home. And especially when they hear that we don't have to throw people out in the streets. If we stop that spending out here, we can take care of people here at home. But if we continue to do what we do, and you have runaway inflation, everybody gets thrown out in the streets because the whole thing comes down on their head. So my argument is to work our way out of this. Don't invent something new. Look to our Constitution. Look to our traditions. Have more confidence in ourselves that we can take care of ourselves if we just have the chance to make a living, and that people, that we're not subject to an environment created by our government that makes it so difficult. So I am encouraged when I go to the universities. The young people are excited about this, and others who are coming out that know that there's a better way of doing things, and that America had great ideals, and great prosperity. We had this great test. Freedom really has been tested such a short period when you look at 6,000 years of human history. Most of history has been tyrants, dictators and kings and pharaohs and governments telling people how to live. So we had this wonderful test, the greatest prosperity, and we're losing it. This is why I fear the economic crisis coming. This is why I fear this endless militancy overseas. And this is why I fear this undermining of the protection of our rights here at home. There's a bill now to stop online piracy act. They want to take over the internet. I mean, can you imagine how much we're going to be curtailed in the spreading of our information if we lose the internet? But there's a bill, it's supposedly going to stop privacy, but actually what's going to do is take over internet and be able to restrict everybody what they do and monitor everything we do on the internet. So it is a big issue. It's coming to a climax. Soon there's going to be an election. Understand there's going to be election January 3rd. Did anybody hear about the January 3rd election? There's going to be an election, and a message is going to be sent. There's a lot of status quo politicians out there. If you don't do anything and we keep the same president, status quo. If you pick another status quo presidential candidate, nothing is going to change. But something has to change. Something will change. It's going to go one way or the other. I know which way I want to go. I know what happens if you do nothing or pick somebody who wants to move more quickly in the wrong direction. I happen to have a strong belief and conviction that the defense of liberty is the defense of America, and that's the direction we ought to go. Thank you very much.
Has the message that the rest of America needs to hear. Now, I know that we're all concerned about America's future, but does that optimistic and inspiring message that you just heard sound like something that maybe the rest of America needs to take a listen to?
Yeah.
No.
I think so too. So we can help Ron Paul amplify that message and launch these issues onto the national stage by turning out to caucus for him. That's just Tuesday night at 7 p.m. right in your own precinct. And it's easy. If you've never done it before, it's easy. If you're not a registered Republican, you can register on the way in the door and participate and help launch Ron Paul's platform onto the national stage with a strong showing here in Iowa. So make the commitment to turn out Tuesday night. Make the commitment to bring friends, family, and neighbors with you to help Ron Paul elevate this vital message. Now, having heard that message, Ron Paul does have to move to another campaign event quickly, but we do have a few minutes for some questions from Iowa voters. So if you're an Iowa voter, if you haven't made up your mind, or maybe if you've had, and you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand. I'll bring the microphone to you so that you can ask a question. And are we on? Very good.
I'm from Newton, Iowa, and I just want to make a comment. I'm retired military, and of all the candidates that are running right now, you're the only one that I would trust to be my commander-in-chief.
I can't add a whole lot to that, but I'll add one thing, that I'm very pleased with it. I did serve five years in the military, but where I'm really pleased, because when I vote against the war, some people say I'm un-American, I vote against the troops. You've heard those stories. And yeah, when you look at the donations, from military, active military personnel, I get twice as much as all the other candidates together. That's reassuring to me that we're on the right track.
All right, somebody else have a question for the congressman. Let me come over here.
Dr. Paul, I'm from Grinnell. Thank you very much for coming and talking. My question is, I agree with a lot of your cutting taxes and paying back our deficit, but what do you think we use government for to help our country? And secondly, being a physician, how would you change healthcare to provide more access to people who don't have it right now? What do you think we can use government for to help our country in a positive way? Right, exactly.
But the role of government is explicitly written out for us in our Constitution, and it's basically to protect our liberty. And the Constitution is written mostly on thou shalt nots on the federal government, and the government should be local. But you need one explicit function of the federal government was national defense. I think our foreign policy undermines our national defense, so you need a strong national defense, you need a sensible foreign policy, but it's explicit on monetary policy. It gives no authority for the Federal Reserve. It says only gold and silver can be legal tender, and this would be very helpful. It prevents the financial bubbles. It also strongly advocates property. You can't take property without due process of law. It's a protecting of life. You can't take life without due process of law. I mean, there's nothing in the Constitution said about assassinating American citizens. So it's very limited, but the court system is part of this. But protecting contracts and sound money and sound national defense, that's what the federal government would be up to. That's why, theoretically, I'm not quite there yet. I'm just going to start on my first $1 trillion to cut. But theoretically, probably about 80% of what the federal government does is technically, unconstitutional. Now, on medical care, I mentioned medical care and how I said we should work our way out of it. And some people might say, well, that's way too much of a compromise because you admit that it's not explicitly authorized in the Constitution to be involved in medical care. It's not, the educational system is not explicitly mentioned in the Constitution either. But in medicine, we've gotten so many people so dependent on it, I don't want to start there. Some people would cut medical care and forget about the overseas spending. So I want to cut this overseas spending, tide people over and work to the day where a young person like you can get out of the system, opt out of the system, get your medical savings accounts where you can put your money aside and get your taxes back, have the cash to deal with your doctor, buy a major medical policy and work. But I don't want to attack those totally dependent, Medicare and Medicaid and these health benefits. So I would do what I could to protect it. But the health care is a mess. I practiced a few years before government got involved in the early 1960s, and it was a lot different. And people said, well, how did they pay for it? I said, well, it's very expensive. My office cost was $5, but now I understand doctors charge a little bit more than that for an office. But it's all this inflation, it's the legal system, and it's the lobbying by drug companies and the lobbying by insurance companies. So it's corporate medicine. It's not free market medicine. We can't say it's failing because it's free market. And it's not even socialized in the sense of socialized medicine, it's corporate medicine, and I think that's a very bad system. So I would want to work out of it with a transition period of not starting and trying to keep the system going so people aren't put out on the street that have become dependent on the government for their medical care.
Hello.
And it could be sorted out, because you can't wave a wand tomorrow and say we're on the gold standard again. It's not that complex. I want to get rid. rid of the Federal Reserve, but I'm not even for saying close that down in one day. I'd like to just be allowed to have competition with honest money, and I think eventually honesty will win out in the end.
Thank you. I agree with what you say in terms of non-intervention and cutting down a lot. But last year, the U.S. Peace Corps had a $374 million budget. What would you do in terms of the Peace Corps, in terms of presenting the U.S. well to other countries?
The Peace Corps is not authorized under the Constitution. That's not a huge amount of money. Those type of activities should be done through, voluntary groups and charitable groups, and we do. Our country will be less charitable because we're getting poorer. But, programs like that should be done more in a charitable way. But if once again, if I looked at priorities, I wouldn't put that at the top of the list. The Peace Corps has probably done a lot less harm than us dropping drone missiles around the country and having collateral damage and inciting a lot of hatred toward us. So, but it's not authorized under the Constitution, and I'm sure that it could be substituted rather easily, but probably not one of the worst overseas programs that we've ever been involved in.
Hi there. The NNSA, the National Nuclear Security Agency, is a semi-autonomous department or agency within the Department of Energy. They manage the nuclear weapons stockpile for the United States. You propose removing the Department of Energy. Who runs these weapons now?
Well, and I have a provision in the bill because he's talking about who's going to handle the nuclear materials and the nuclear weapons. I'd put it under the Department of Defense, and put it in another department, but there would be transition, and I don't ignore that, but what I want to get rid of is this, management of energy, subsidizing one group and not the other, and punishing one group and not the other. I want a free market to work. And if you're going to give tax credits, which I'm not opposed to tax credits should be given to everybody equally. The market has to sort out the most efficient way of producing energy. So once the government gets involved and the lobbyists get involved, and then they have certain groups benefit the other, you don't have the market sorting these things out. But you get rid of the subsidies too, no direct subsidies, and you pay a lot of bureaucrats to do this. But the nuclear thing I've dealt with, and it would be under another department, under Defense Department.
Right here.
Okay. Dr. Paul, you've talked about removing the Frank Dodd and
Do
Sarbanes.
a much better job. The SEC came in the 1930s because the Fed was instrumental in the bubble in the 20s and the Depression. And things like the SEC and a greater burden of regulations always delay recoveries because business people can't figure it out. And that's what, when Enron went bankrupt, the Republicans put on, Sarbanes-Oxley. Once again, it was another burden. It is estimated that Sarbanes-Oxley has cost the business community over $1 trillion, and that Obama's health care will be another, Dodd-Frank will be another $1 trillion. So Obama's care, we don't know how much that's going to cost. So these regulations is very, very troublesome. But you say, well, how are they going to do it? The derivatives market, what would have happened? No bailouts. Once they get regulated, the bailouts. See, there's a moral hazard when the regulators are there. Oh, SEC was in charge, so I can invest in that company, and they'll tell me whether it's a good company or not, and they're deceived. And the derivatives are so evil because the banks were involved, then they transfer it into the bank accounts, and then they get the insurance of, the deposit insurance. That's where the real harm's done. So when you have these regulations, they sort of protect these people rather than punish them. They should go bankrupt. So it's the government insurance is really not insurance. It's just a guarantee that somebody's going to get help and bailed out. But markets protect you against fraud. When Enron went bankrupt, it was in Texas, had nothing to do with the SEC. SEC didn't do anything to protect you, but they were punished through fraud laws. Commit fraud, you go to prison. If you don't live up to your contract, you get penalized. If you go bankrupt, you go bankrupt. You know, you have to go through the bankruptcy. So I think free market regulations are many times much tougher than having the regulations written, you know, by the people who are supposed to be regulated. Bankers write the regulations. When it comes to the FDA, you know, all the FDA is going to protect us from all this evil stuff going on. The drug companies get to write the regulations, and they protect themselves and squeeze out their competition. But markets are good regulators. I think markets can regulate the environment too. You'd still have to have some government there, but basically private property rights protects your property. You cannot abuse and pollute your neighbor's property, water, air, or land. And if you do, you ought to be able to haul them off into court and settle that rather quickly, and states would have a lot of progress. But just building huge bureaucracy as up in Washington, and it doesn't solve the problem. It usually conditions us to believe, oh, they will take care of us.
Dr. Paul, I've been a supporter of yours for years now, ever since your last presidential campaign. I have a question about foreign policy. Short of an actual attack on our shores, at what point would you authorize the use of force against another country?
He's asking about when could we use force short of somebody invading our country? I voted for the authority to go after those individuals responsible for 9/11. And because that was a special circumstance. I was disappointed because the information that we have has been totally ignored. You know, the 9/11 Commission, things that Wolfowitz have said, and many people realize it's related, you know, to our foreign policy. We need to know what the motives are. But because the attack occurred and we were under attack, those individuals should be punished. But my big beef there was that we went off on a tangent and went after people who had nothing to do with it, and we went into nation building. So that made a big difference. Matter of fact, I offered a constitutional answer short of deciding to go, because I sensed we were going to go to war against a lot of countries. I said, look, if there's a group of individuals out there and if they committed a crime, why don't we use the principle of a letter of marque and reprisal, which was used to go after the pirates, you know, a limited war to individuals rather than a whole country. But if somebody attacks us, that was great. But I don't foresee a lot of times when there's fights going on around the world that we should get involved in. I think that our goal should be to avoid that, avoid the entangling alliances and don't get involved. I think the world would be certainly better off. I think it would, we would be better off. Besides, you know, I'm sure there's so many people in here might be more willing to go sooner to some of these things because you don't have any choice anymore. We're so broke. This is what destroyed, in a good way, it destroyed and undermined the Soviet Empire. Guess what? They were so silly as to go in and occupy Afghanistan. You know, what are we doing? We're in Afghanistan, but we didn't have to fight them. They fell apart because for a financial reason, the economics. And when I was drafted in 1962, that was over the missile crisis in Cuba. We had 30,000. They had about 30,000 nuclear weapons and missiles. And but fortunately, we did not have to fight. We did not have to fight the Soviets. It was an economic struggle. But I don't think anybody can dare touch us. Our military is so strong. We have more weapons than everybody else put together, and nobody can attack us. But I think we might do harm to ourselves by not protecting our liberties here at home. But I don't see many times when we should be marching our troops around the world. I have some sympathies to having to preserve a strong national defense. I have a lot of sympathies for submarines. I just think, and I'm not a weapons expert, but submarines always made a lot of sense to me about how you could protect this country without having troops every place. I mean, we're in 130 some countries, 900 bases, and believe me, we are not out of Iraq. That's a dream if you think we're out of Iraq. We're in there for long term, unless the people not me, unless the people change their attitude about what we should do and how to run this, how to run the foreign policy. Right now, I sense that people are ready for a change in our foreign policy. They're ready for a change in our domestic spending policy. And I think that probably is a good indication why we're doing a little bit better in the polls.
All right, we have time for just one more.
Oh, Lisa. Brian's friend, right? Yeah, how are you? Thank you.
Not in the picture, does?
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. You guys